up I will realise I've just stuck a 3 onto the 0 because the last time this was used was... Anyway, and we would love to have questions from you in the Twitter or on whatever social media you wish to use. Kevin, welcome to Cambridge.
Oh, nice to be back again, thank you. Thank you very much. Is the mic working? Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. Hugh said to say a few words about experience with David Mackay. And I mean, this really captures my impression of David and his real attributes. When he was the Chief Scientific Officer at the Department for Energy and Climate Change, I knew one of the other Chief Scientific Officers for one of the other departments who shall remain nameless. And he was quite critical of David because he said he was politically naive. To me, that was an attribute. I think if you're a chief scientist in the department, you need to be politically naive, or at least you need to just park those. I mean, you disregard the political sensibilities. I think that is the job of a chief scientist, and my concern has been actually a lot of the chief scientific officers have been too easily influenced by the politics of the day, and that is not their role. And that's what I really liked about David. Whether you agreed with him or not, what he had running straight through him was integrity. And that's an absolutely key characteristic, in my view, of an academic, is to disregard the interests of the funders or the politicians, or even necessarily our colleagues, except for their academic views. And that's what we should aspire to. It's what we should try to foster and engender within our institutions. And I think David did that really very well indeed. So I've called this talk today, so I've got to stay here, so I apologize. I've got a certain area to walk in. I've called it From Iniquity to Integrity. There's no hiding from carbon budgets. And it's work that I've pulled together over lots of years, really, with a lot of other colleagues in the Tyndall Centre, which is mentioned on here, and some other ones here in Sweden and in Bergen, and now with another colleague who initially I knew in the Tyndall Centre. We've set up this, at the moment it's still sort of in its sort of fledgling state, Climate Uncensored, which I'll put on at the end of the website for it, where we're putting some work that we do, which we try to make it more accessible. So I'm going to start off with a health warning. Those of you, I always think of this as a modern film, which just shows how old I'm getting. But anyway, this is The Matrix. Has anyone seen The Matrix? Yeah. Phew, that's all right, good. So this is a red pill presentation. I don't like my conclusions, but they are my conclusions. I try not to overplay them or indeed underplay them. My language may appear provocative, but I think it accurately reflects the analysis. And I think I would suggest that it sounds provocative because you have to contrast it with the sort of cosy climate stories that we have told ourselves for 30 years, which I think have been deeply misleading. And we've normalized those stories. We're still normalizing those stories today. So against that backdrop, and you may think that those stories are fine, that's something perhaps we can discuss. But I hope at least you'll sort of taste the red pill as I see the red pill, and you know, if you disagree with what I'm saying rather than dislike, say I don't like the conclusions, so you know, it's not, as an academic I don't care about like and dislike, I only care about agree and disagree and what the reasons are, then we can hopefully have a chat at the end. So why are we concerned about climate change? What's our, what is it, particularly we've focused significantly on temperature? Well, at the end of the day, it's the impacts that matter. It's not the temperature. We've got this sort of proxy that people like me spend my whole life playing with, but really we have to remind ourselves that what we're looking at are impacts. And we're not looking at impacts, we're looking at the rate of change of impacts. That's what's really important. If impacts occur over 1 million years, so what? If the impacts occur over 5 years, then they can be same impacts, then they can be devastating. And so it's the rate of change of impacts that's really important. And the question we then ask is, when we look at these rates of change of impacts, can we, so it's human systems, adequately adapt to such rates of changes, and can also other ecosystems, which of course we are part of. So we're asking, well, what rates of change can we expect systems to reasonably deal with? And then that's come down to us sort of having this temperature proxy. I'm not saying it's the right one, but I think probably in 2023 it's probably quite hard to rethink what we should do now. But I think if we're starting again, we probably wouldn't use temperature. So, but we have that, that's what we work with. But we have to remind ourselves it is a proxy for rates of change of impacts. And I think also we have to remind ourselves who is the we in this. The we is massively important. I'm going to play it out increasingly throughout this presentation. So these are things that hopefully some of you are familiar with, the burning ember diagrams. It's in a way of sort of capturing or making the translation from impacts to temperature. So we've gone from the impacts to temperature. And these are sort of, if you like, they're sort of families of impacts. And then we relate them to temperature. And the way they're captured in these nice burning ember diagrams is, you know, quite obviously the redder they get, the less desirable they are. So, so you can, and the different sets of impacts that you're down here. And these are something you can look at. There are plenty of publications around these burning ember diagrams, and they get renewed every so often. So that's, you know, you can see the 2001, 2009, 2014, and if you look at the latest one in 2021, what I think you see straight away is that the amount of red, purple, and slightly undesirable colours, at least from an impact point of view, I mean, they're coming south. They're heading further down. So the temperatures that we initially thought were fine, now we're now thinking actually the impacts at those temperatures look pretty severe. And so when we thought about 2 degrees centigrade before, you now look at 1.5, well, you know, the sort of impacts for what we used to think at 2 are now occurring at 1.5. Oh, it looked like they're going to occur at 1.5. But it's easy then to focus on, well, 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, we're not there yet anyway. They're in the future. But actually, climate change is a threat. And I was quite rightly reprimanded on 2 occasions at the Glasgow COP by a speaker from the Philippines and one from, I can't remember where the other one was from now, but saying that, you know, I was using this language of threat and say it's not a threat, it's a reality. Let's remind ourselves it's a reality. So at the Glasgow COP, these are openings, on the first day of the Glasgow COP, these are 2 statements that were read out in the sort of national statements you could make right at the beginning. They stopped counting the death toll when it reached 6,000, but there are 1,600 bodies still missing. Massive floods, wildfires, rising seas, along with the countless lives they take and the livelihoods they upend, are realities that many nations are already facing. So climate change is a very serious issue in many parts of the world today. And in fact, our government, I generally take our policymakers at face value. This is naive, I know. I assume that they are not lying, despite the evidence to show the contrary for some of them. But our government signed up at the Glasgow Climate Pact and expressed alarm and utmost concern that human activities have caused around 1.1 degrees centigrade of warming, probably nearer 1.2 now, and the impact's already being felt in every region. So, you know, we apparently are concerned about this issue at the global level. But these statements are statements, if you like, from lay people, from non-experts. So other people say, well, yeah, but what does the science tell us? So this is working group 2. These are 3 statements from working group 2, and the important thing to note is the word have. Oops, sorry. The important thing to note is the word have. You know, increasing weather and climate events have exposed millions of people to acute food insecurity and reduced water security. Losses of food production and access to food have increased malnutrition, and heat waves, so forth, have resulted in mortality and morbidity. So these things are already occurring. It's not as if they're going to occur. And if we take the IPCC science as being reasonably robust and a good way to capture the academic contribution, then we're saying that's already happened. So what is it that we've committed to? What have we, all the signatories to the Paris Agreement, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was ratified in 1994, came out the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. The first thing to bear in mind is that what we agree to is what we decide as political people, as citizens, not as scientists. Or scientists might do, but science can't tell you what's dangerous. It should, in my view, inform the discussion, but science can't tell you what's dangerous. A scientist can, because the scientists will have their particular view on what they think is dangerous, but science cannot tell you what's dangerous. The decision is ultimately political. And so then it comes down to who is the we that makes the decisions. And if any of you attend any of the COPs, you'll know who the we is. Yeah, you'll see the poorer countries will be sitting on beanbags in the corridors with no facilities, and the wealthy countries will have all their scientists and lawyers and everything else in a huge place with all nice drinks and everything else there, and they're about to swap out personnel during the night with negotiations, as the poorer countries won't. So it's a completely biased system. So the we is a very, very small group of surprisingly high emitters. Despite the drawbacks to all of this sort of messy political process has brought us to the Paris Agreement, where we've started now to define what's called in UNFCCC dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. That's what we've got to avoid. That's what we signed up to in 1994. And Paris then put some numbers on it to hold well below 2 and pursue 1.5, and to do so in accordance with the best science and on the basis of equity. And I'm going to increasingly bring out this issue of equity as I progress through this talk. And then, remember that was at Paris, and then oddly enough we had 1.5 at Paris, but we didn't really have a lot of information on what the impacts are like at 1.5. It was the typical sort of, we'll make the statement first, then find out the conclusions and the reasons afterwards, which actually a lot of life is like that. It's post hoc justification for views you have in the first place. And that's what happened here. So we had SR 1.5 and then we had AR 6, and what comes out quite clearly is that the impacts of 1.5 look pretty devastating, but the impacts at 2 look much worse. And that's simplifying a huge amount of work there, but that's broadly it. You don't want either of them, would be what, in my view, from those. But then I think when we had the COP in Glasgow, there was a lot more emphasis on 1.5. There is a lot more emphasis on 1.5, despite the fact that it gets almost increasingly unlikely, if not impossible, to avoid it. And that's a debate that is ongoing and live. This is the government chief scientist opening again up in COP that said the crucial at stake to keep 1.5 is kept alive. I don't think it's a negotiable thing. We're supposed to stick to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And I'm going to come back to this picture later. So I'll ask you a question about where it is. I assume that because you're in Cambridge, you'll know. What do well below 2 degrees centigrade and pursue 1.5 imply? So I want to now translate the language of Paris, because Paris, of course, is legalistic sort of language. It's just awash with lawyers poring over every letter. And it says things like well below and should rather than shall, those sorts of things. So there's lots of that in there. But if you're trying to do something with the science, you have to sort of translate that language into something that's in the language of science. And my take on this, and I don't think it's one that probably many people would hugely disagree, that well below 2 degrees centigrade, converting it into the IPCC language in the working group 1, something like an 83% chance of 2 degrees centigrade. Okay, it sounds a bit odd saying 83. That's the number they use there. That's why I'm using it here. So that's what they're. So it's a good chance of staying well below 2. Some people might say it's a bit less than that. Other people might say it should be more than that. And it's interesting that carbon budget is the same as about a 1 in 6 chance of 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, I'm using all the headline carbon budgets in the IPCC. I think it would be fair to say, and I think rightly so, the IPCC is an innately conservative process. Bringing a consensus like that is innately conservative. And that's not wrong, but that does require a user to be more discerning of the information from it. So when you look at those budgets, you need to be aware that they're probably the upper end, they're about as big as you could possibly allow them to be. And if you look within the IPCC, it does talk about lots of additional feedbacks that are not factored into the budgets that could be there and could be very significant because they're not sufficiently well understood and quantified to be able to put in the main carbon budgets. So what I'm using here are the headline values, which I would argue are quite conservative, well, probably very conservative, and that these are the maximum values you should be looking at. You really should be looking at values lower than this. And like I said, I can point you towards things that point that out. And someone mentioned before the new Hansen paper that points those things out as well. The secondary commitment for 2 degrees centigrade was, we took, myself and others have taken a reading that it's a 50-50 chance of 1.5. So, yeah, and I'll come back to this later, but that carbon budget for this is about twice as big as the carbon budget for this. So it makes a big difference between those two. But that gives you the range that I think would be fair for Paris. But when we then had SR 1.5 and AR 6 telling us about the impacts. And a lot of people saying, well, actually, hang on a second, 2 degrees centigrade seems a bit high. Surely we should be looking more at 1.5. So I do think there's an argument to say that they should be swapped around. And the primary commitment now from sort of Glasgow onwards probably should be aiming at 1.5. And the secondary one should be really at 2 degrees centigrade. I mean, you don't really want to get there. You want to stay well below it, i.e. 1.5, if not below that. So I think that's probably where you might argue where we are now. But of course, that's what you've got to contrast that with, well, how are we doing? What's the chances of that? And that's what I'm going to come to as I progress through this presentation. So what does the IPCC tell us about the timeline? And the timeline is so important, I think, here. That's the area I think we're really poor at dealing with, sometimes because it just raises very difficult questions. But from an engineering point of view, I'm an engineer that used to design and build offshore oil platforms and work on ships years ago. My experience has been that scientists, although they use time in their equations, actually really poor at grasping time. And so I think time is a hugely important dimension on climate change that we underplay massively. So I'm going to try and pull that out a little bit here. So to start off with, what we can see from the climate change, from the IPCC, and I used this talk the other day in the Home Office, and I've used it also, where else was it? And it was a talk to MPs with the Chief Medical Officer last week that was organised in the House of Commons. That the climate does not respond, despite what politicians and others might think, that it does respond to these things. It doesn't give a damn about good intentions, Machiavellian policies, eloquent arguments, legal niceties, promises of tech tomorrow, or accountancy scams. And in that, I include net zero, which I think is almost the ultimate accountancy scam that we've pretty much bought into now. All of these are trumped by the brutal beauty of the physics. It doesn't give a damn about any of the rest of that. And the physics is sort of captured in a conservative way, if you like, in relation to the numbers, from Assessment Report 5 up through to the latest one here. And it's about carbon budgets. It's not about long-term targets. It doesn't give a damn what you do in 2050. It's about the total amount of CO2 you dump in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, but most significantly CO2. And I will focus here on CO2 mostly, but recognizing the other gases are important. Probably 25% or so of the warming comes from the other gases, and there are some big issues around some of those other gases as well. So it's the carbon budgets that matter. And if we take the latest IPCC report, AR6, and we look at the carbon budgets there, these are the headline budgets. Remember that these, I would take these as being the highest levels you should really be thinking about, particularly from a precautionary point of view. And it does point out that if you were to look at these and think of the other feedbacks, then you need to adjust these budgets by something around about 100 gigatons per 1 degree centigrade. So if you look at 1.5, you have to reduce them by about 150 gigatons. So what it can tell you is that for 1.5 degrees centigrade from 2020, then you can dump in the atmosphere about 500 billion tons of CO2 for a 50-50 chance of it. And if you want a 2 degree centigrade, then you can dump in the atmosphere 900 billion tons. And what's interesting there is that, look at they're both the same value. So if you want an outside chance of 1.5 is also the same as a good chance of 2 degrees centigrade. The budget's the same. And that's, I think, been misunderstood in some of the debates around 1.5. So what I want to do now is update those latest budgets, because we're not in 2020, and because we're putting emissions out at such a huge rate, 41 billion tons of CO2 every single year. Where are we today? So updating these, this is just a bit of arithmetic. There's no smoke and mirrors in here. So 50-50 chance of 1.5 and 83% chance of 2. They're the budgets we have now, about 380 and 780 billion tons. That's how many years they are at current emission rates, at 9.4, 19.3. And I won't be putting it out here, but it is worth noting that if we follow the NDCs, the pledges that countries have made, there is no reduction by 2030. It could be up a little bit, could be down a bit, but basically no reduction by 2030 if you follow the pledges of the countries around the world. And they're not looking at all the change in those pledges at the moment. They keep talking about it, but there's no real impetus for that. So you think by then, you've just wiped out most of these budgets. By 2030, the budget you've got left for 2 degrees centigrade is about the same as you've got for 1.5 now. And many people would argue the budget for 1.5 now is not viable. So it's saying that 2 degrees centigrade, a good chance of 2 degrees centigrade is not viable by 2030. The NDCs, the pledges, basically just say, you're not going to do Paris. And yet, who's talking about that? You must never see that the actual pledges we have say, forget Paris, because it's blowing the budgets out of the water. They're the reduction rates. Remember, these are global numbers. If you were to reduce from today, from last month, January, we've put out 4 billion tons since then, probably. Almost 11% for 1.5 degrees centigrade, 11% every single year, and 5% for 2 degrees centigrade. It's just the arithmetic. There's nothing fancy in that at all. That's how much we're using the budgets up per month at the moment. The 1.5 budget, we're using up at almost 1% every single month. And I think it's 4.4, I think it works out at, for the 2 degree centigrade budget. So really, I think that's a completely different framing of what you normally get to see or normally get to hear when people are talking about these things. But it's just the numbers. There's nothing in there really more than that. Just look at those graphically. That's the percentage reduction rates. I mean, just look how steep they are. That's coming down immediately. That's not sort of waiting for some policies to be put in place and let's get the technology going. That's saying, well, it's a magical integrated assessment model world. You just start immediately. Just press the button, off goes the model. And so you've got these incredibly fast reduction rates there. If you were to just draw a straight line, it looks like that. These are the same values under the curve. So for 1.5, we're talking about globally 0 emissions by 2040 and 0 by 2060. But remember, that's if you start now, or started last month, coming straight down. And if you were to say, well, actually, we're going to probably like to delay in that, we're going to have to negotiate and get, there's all the sort of practical inertia and other issues there, then it starts to look like this. Now, the reduction rates here are huge. But if you have any sort of delay, look what happens to the reduction rates. 30-odd% per annum, what's how we get around here, for 1.5. Yeah, and that's not much of a delay for 2 degrees centigrade. And yet, you're getting near that here. Well over 20% per annum. So this, again, I think, just the numbers, just some simple plots. You just do it in Excel. But that's a global picture. And we signed up at Paris and from the UNFCCC onwards to this whole concept of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. In other words, the poorer parts of the world get longer to make the shift away from fossil fuels than the richer parts of the world. So it's an equity component that's embedded in every single agreement right the way through still today, despite the fact lots of rich countries have tried to undermine it, continually undermine it. It's still there. It's still deeply embedded in the whole process. And again, I'm assuming our leaders are not lying when they sign up to these things. So what happens when you add the equity part to it? Well, using the language of Paris, Paris just splits the world into 2 parts, and that's generally the way we've been doing that since Kyoto. It now gives them the name of developed country parties and developing country parties, and you could argue that's not a particularly helpful separation because obviously within the developing one you've got Rwanda and you've got China, very, very different countries. But in other ways it does capture it reasonably well. In the developed group it isn't that, it's wide range, but it's not as wide a range. In the developing group there is a wider range of countries than that. And so we've used that language in a few papers we've done, but particularly one from 2020, I think it was. 2020. So we just split the budgets between developed and developing countries. There's a lot behind all of this. And what you see is that we need to be 0 emissions by about 2031 for 1.5 degrees centigrade for a 50-50 chance of 1.5. Now, when you look at that initially, a lot of people go, particularly high emitters, well, that's not very fair, that. We're having to do much more than the poor parts of the world. Well, not really, because about 18% of the population live under the orange line, and about 82% of the population live under the blue line, and 82% of the population live under the orange line. So even when you do something like this, the cumulative emissions per person are still in the favour of the colonials of us. So even when you do something like this, it embeds further inequity out into the future. And unfortunately, we're in a position now that you can't do much about that in any realistic way. But I think we should acknowledge the fact that all the futures that we have are deeply inequitable, and our job should be to try to compensate in some way for all that. So you go to 2 degrees centigrade, which, of course, brings with it a lot more impacts. And yeah, hey presto, we get a few more years. So, 2036-ish. Now, the argument can be made, well, can you do something with those curves? You could draw those curves differently. Well, you can't draw the 1.5 ones in any way really differently. They're basically just dropping off a cliff. There's not much you can do about them. You can pretend to finesse them, but you can't really. The 2 degrees centigrade ones, there's a little bit of flexibility. But what you'd have to do there, what we mean by flexibility when we say that, rich white people say that, what they mean is, can we not give the poor parts of the world a bit less? That's what we really mean by flexibility. The only flexibility there is to say the poor countries can have less, and then we get a little bit more. But that's, I think we'd struggle to put that down in writing. We may think that and say it down in the pub when no one else was listening, but that's what we mean. So there's not really any flexibility in those divisions either. So then the question is, of the developed country budget, and this is all sort of detailed in one of the papers that we did, what's the bit that the UK should get out of that? And we just took the UK as being one of the developed countries. We didn't take a particularly sort of UK-centric approach that we're better than all the other ones. So we just assumed we're just one of the developed countries. And so when you play this out here for 2 degrees centigrade and 1.5, these are the carbon budgets that you get. These are broadly grandfathered from the budget you have for developed countries. 3.1 billion tonnes and 1.3 billion tonnes. And for those of you familiar with the UK, we emit around about 400, if you include aviation and shipping, about 400 million tonnes or 0.4 billion tonnes every year. So that's between 3 and 8 years of current emissions. Annual reduction rates of 10 to 15% for the top one for 2 degrees centigrade and over 20% for 1.5 degrees centigrade. If you were to draw straight lines from now 2039 for 2 degrees centigrade and 2030 for 1.5 degrees centigrade. Zero emissions, no fossil fuels, no flying, unless we can find some way of putting that into the technology there by then, which we wouldn't be able to. No driving other than being very low carbon. So massive changes in the norms of how we operate in a very wealthy part of the world. And the we there, again, I'm saying that with scare quotes around it. So how are we doing in comparison with that? How are we doing in the UK? Well, the UK, like every other country, is leading the world. So it's quite amazing that the physics hasn't quite caught up here. That every country is leading on climate change, and yet the emissions keep going up, and so does the concentration in the atmosphere. So it's a bit baffling as to why that's the case. So we're 51% below our 1990 levels in 2020, and quite commonly it's said about 45%, because obviously 2020 was a bit of an anomaly. But if you include aviation and shipping, which is missing from most inventories, thanks to the Chicago Agreement in 1949, I think, and then the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. So most countries emit aviation and shipping. To the Committee on Climate Change's significant credit, they now include that in their analysis, though the government's less keen. So, but what we submit to the UNFCCC still excludes it. And if you include imports and exports, the UK has had a 15 to 20% reduction since 1990. So that's about 0.5% every single year. So it's barely leadership. And you can argue a large part of that has been the closure of coal. And that coal has been closed through a mixture of reasons, some of which has been the carbon floor price, but quite a lot of it was just political disagreement between Margaret Thatcher and a sort of legacy of that, and Arthur Scargill a long time ago. So there's been a gradual phase out of coal that then went quite rapid in the 80s and 90s. And so that's really what fed into this, one of the factors. So we haven't really done that much here. It's not judicious climate change policies over here, not yet. But that's true of every other country. Denmark's no better, so it's worse. Sweden's worse. So there are the more progressive, so-called climate progressive countries are not climate progressive. They're not as bad as Germany or Belgium or Ireland or Norway, but they're still terrible. So there are no climate progressive countries in the wealthy parts of the world, and that includes the UK. So I'm going to just say a little bit about net zero. Why is this so different to a sort of net zero framing? I think this picture can tell you, this is them discussing net zero and other things in Davos. This tells you why. Lots of rich white men in suits discussing what we should do about climate change. The man in the middle, Carney, when he was the Bank of England, got £800,000 a year in salary. And what's that? I mean, that must be, is that about 30 nurses? 30 nurses? Which do we need? Yeah. Which are key workers between the two? So it tells us straight away something about how we're responding to the challenge when you see this sort of thing going on. So why is it so different? Well, firstly, net zero is a new phrase. It's just everywhere. People just use it just so easily. It flips out net zero, net zero. But, well, what do you mean net zero? Oh, I have no idea what it means. Well, firstly, if you look at the IPCC report, AR5, does it give the year? 2014. It was used 24 times in the summary for policymakers, all of which were to do with housing. So it was nothing to do with the big picture of net zero. It was all to do with passive house and things like that. So it wasn't used once in the way that we use it today. Look at AR6. It's used 963 times in the summary for policymakers. All to do with carbon dioxide removal, negative emission technologies and so forth, or delay, another word. You look at the Committee on Climate Change report in 2015, it wasn't used once. If you look at their report in 2020, it's used between 3,000 and 5,000 times. I mean, I doubt you can find a page without it on. So it's not a new, this is a new phrase. Now, it has some scientific legitimacy, but that's not how it's used here. It's not how it's been used when we just dropped it in sort of normal discussions about climate change. So it typically assumes multi-layered substitution. And all of this, to me, is all part of a delay and procrastination. It's like an Exxon in control of your climate change debate. That's what this is all really about. So it allows you to compare gases, CO2 for methane. It allows you to look at different sources, so CO2 from cars versus agricultural N2O. It allows you to substitute between a flight today and trees capturing CO2 in 2070. So it allows substitution of, in every single way you can possibly use in an accountancy spreadsheet to show you don't have to do anything, or don't have to do so much. A ton is a ton is a ton of greenhouse gases. It ignores chemistry, it ignores atmospheric lifetimes, and it ignores levels of certainty and risk. If you get on a plane or drive your car, you're guaranteed to dump the CO2 out of the lithosphere into the atmosphere. If you plant a tree in 2030 to absorb that CO2 you put out today, there's no guarantee you're even going to plant it, let alone it'll actually capture the CO2. But we just say in the spreadsheet, yeah, fine, it works. The other thing it relies on net zero is a huge amounts of carbon dioxide removal, CDR. And the names of this always change, because every time people get, eventually figure out there's another Machiavellian fraud, we have to rename it something else. So it'll be called something different in a couple of years' time. So CDR, which no one really used that term very commonly a few years ago. It was more negative emission technologies. And if you go back to 2010, and we're just talking geoengineering in a wider way, we capture all these things. So we're gradually getting this wider sort of sets of alphabet soup to confuse us. We've got negative emission technologies and nature-based solutions. Now, I presume most of you are reasonably familiar with these things, but this is what we have in the sort of locked up in this idea that we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere, our children and children's children, can remove CO2 from the atmosphere in years from now, decades from now, most of it. They're embedded in every single scenario. There's virtually I don't think there are any scenarios that don't include some significant amount of CDR, high-level scenarios from the IPCC and from most governments on this. And they typically assume hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 capture. Not a little bit, hundreds of billions of tons. That's just astronomical. And most of it's after 2050. So, the people who are putting it forward will either be retired in Tuscany or pushing up the daisies somewhere. They're not expecting that they're going to do it. Just to give some sort of scale of this, from an industry point of view, this industry doesn't exist, by the way, other than a few pilot schemes. But it's roughly the same size as the current oil and gas industry. Now, that's fine if you had one scenario in 10 like that, or 10 in 1,000. But if you've got 999 in 1,000 like that, that tells you you've got a systemic bias. And that's what we have. Every scenario has this, because you've got to reconcile your scenario with what is considered to be politically possible in the short term. So there are only pilot schemes for this. Even things like carbon capture and storage. And there's a quite important part of carbon capture and storage. It's the last letter, S, storage. At the moment, or 2021, the world stored 7 million tons of CO2. The world stored 7 million tons of CO2. The UK emitted 400 million tons of CO2. So we managed to store in 2021 0.02% of our fossil fuel emissions. And yet virtually every scenario just assumes CCS is going to work, let alone CCS with biomass, which is what you get under most of these net scenarios. Now, these things don't exist in any form of scale. If you went to just one decimal point, you'd say there is no CCS in the world. Now, some people tell you, no, it's more than that. What they mean is the carbon capture. We do capture carbon, a bit more than that, about 45 million tons, but we then use it to dump and squeeze out more oil so we can burn that. So that's not really carbon capture and storage. So unpick the numbers a bit more and you get a different position. So my position on CDR, yeah, let's fund it. I am very strongly in favour of funding CDR, and whatever those sorts might be. Let's assess all their ecological impacts and their social impacts as well. So stringent sustainability criteria and deploy them if they work at scale. But let's just assume they don't work at scale. Let's separate them out. Let's not have a spreadsheet that allows us to swap between things. Let's just have set targets for the things you look at. So you might have a certain amount of CDR per year, but it has nothing to do with your cutting emissions from fossil fuels. They should be separate. Because they probably aren't going to work at scale. And anyway, we're probably going to need quite a lot of some sort of negative emissions to deal with emissions from agriculture, because it looks like we cannot eliminate all the emissions from agriculture. Even if the world went vegan and we use lots of organic fertilizer, you're still going to get a lot of methane and N2O, and probably quite significant quantities. I mean, it's quite uncertain as what they would look like, but many billions of tons a year. So you're probably going to have some way to compensate for this warming, which does mean that energy has to be zero CO2. But it's not in the scenarios. They've always got lots and lots of fossil fuel energy. Now, net zero as well, another strong argument that's made for it is that its real strength is it's a policy that everyone can get behind, and that's certainly true. Everyone's behind net zero. But for me, that actually weakens it, because its vagueness means that it's appealing to everyone. So these paragons of climate virtue are all signed up to net zero, yet they all have no intention of being zero fossil fuels. Absolutely none at all. They're all looking for more oil and gas at the moment, as are this group of charlatans. All signed up to net zero, all desperately pursuing every bit of, what was the thing that we had recently from that idiot who temporarily was at business at Bays? Rees-Mogg. We're going to get out every cubic, what did he say? Did he say cubic inch? He must have said cubic inch of oil and gas out of the North Sea, I think was the quote. So we're looking to do that. The Norwegians are giving loads more licenses to go into the Arctic now. So there are a few exceptions. The new Colombian leader, just got in recently, got in on the back of one of his things was that he said we're not going to have any more development of oil and gas in Colombia. And he's looking to try and put that in place. So, and to phase out the existing ones, but that will be a phase out, but to have no more oil and gas. So we are some leaders out there, Colombia, Costa Rica, not the UK. So, firstly, net zero is not, it's not zero. Nothing like zero emissions. If you look at the Committee on Climate Change, again, to its credit, has a really easy accessible spreadsheet. I wish every other country had that. They don't. So you actually see what's behind the CCC's thinking in the UK, and that's really helpful, except for it's quite disturbing, because they still have like 31 million tons, I think, of fossil fuel energy in 2050. Now, the scenarios don't go on after 2050, but you assume it doesn't stop on that day, it carries on. So that looks like any reasonable extrapolation of, say, that being zero by 2075, that means you've got about 500 million tons of CO2 from the UK after 2050. That's more emissions after 2050 than the Kenyans have emitted so far in history. So it's, again, it just embeds that deep inequality there. But it's very alluring. It allows you to expand the carbon budget, so you don't have to do anything politically too challenging. It just ultimately just sort of disguises green business as usual as being in line with the Paris temperature and equity commitments, where I would argue is nothing like that. So I think net zero is deeply problematic, and every time we use it, we feed into that. We need to at least be opening up that dialogue. Now, I want to focus now on this equity part of this. I would just say that so the work we did in the paper we published, we looked at the UK budgets. The UK budget from the CCC is over 6 billion tonnes, so it's twice, well, it's about 2.5 times bigger than what we think is reasonable for the UK. So we would argue that the UK budget is more in line with 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade of warming. And that's actually similar for Sweden. We did the analysis for Sweden as well. So I want to focus now on equity. So I would argue, regardless of your moral position, if you think we want to hold to 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, and you might argue that's a moral framing, but let's just say we've signed up to it and we abide by our commitments, then I would argue if you ally those with the IPCC, then equity is an important part of that. It's not, you can't only solve it with equity. Technology is absolutely key, and as an engineer, I'm probably biased, but it has a real important role. But in isolation, technology is simply insufficient. So you often see these sorts of curves, just emissions per person. They're important, but don't be misled by them. So don't be taken in by means. Means are helpful, but they also hide things as well. So if you look at the UK, and I think this is, I still, other people don't find this quite as disturbing as me, but I find this deeply disturbing. UK household income, which relates very closely to emissions. The mean in the UK is £37,000 a year. You wouldn't get a professor out of bed for £37,000 a year, but that's the mean household income, remember? Oops. Oh. The median is 31. And the mode, I think they're done in two grand chunks, is 23. So they think the energy price for houses, a typical household in the UK, might be going towards £3,000 to £4,000. If you want £23,000, and you've got a bill like that coming in, you can see why you have this choice between heating and eating. This is the 6th richest country in the world, and those are the incomes that a lot of people are having to live with. And they relate hugely to our emissions. And I'll come back to why I think that has coloured our scenarios. Half of the global CO2, these are the slides I've used repeatedly, so you'll hear this from other people as well, they're commonly known numbers. Half of CO2 comes from 10% of the population, but I think this came out of Sivan Kartha's work, I think it was last year. The top 1% have lifestyles that give rise to twice the emissions as the bottom half of the world's population. Now, I don't know about you, but to me that's obscene. Absolutely obscene. It should be called out at every single point that we can. but it's not. You'll get Amal Rajan or any of the other Radio 4 presenters up the backside of Bill Gates or Schwarzenegger or any of these other people, billionaires on there, who are well in that category. Yeah, they won't be questioning them at all. It'll just be the usual sort of sycophantic nonsense. But that's true, of course. Who else is in that group? The professors. It's not just the billionaires in that group. There's a lot of other people in that group who sit there very uncomfortably. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, this is a slide that I've been using for years, but it still holds. I did check it again recently. So just imagine, I apologise if anyone's ever seen this before. Just imagine that we thought we did live in a climate emergency, that we actually believed what we've signed up for. And then we had regulations around the world to stop the top 10% of emitters, or to get their carbon footprint down to the average European citizen. So this isn't that impoverished. This is probably still about 30 times more than the typical Rwandan. So that. And the rest of the other 90% of the world's population made no difference. This will not solve climate change, but it gives you a 30% cut in emissions. If it's a climate emergency, you can do that in a year. If it's a real climate emergency, you can do it in probably about 2 weeks. Now, the numbers tell us quite a lot about the moral framing of climate change. So why has it remained a taboo subject? Why is it virtually never discussed? And that's a little unfair, because it is discussed a bit, but it's probably 5% of the discussion, no, less than that, 2% of the discussion is around issues of equity. Well, I think, look at who sets the agenda. Who builds the mitigation models? Who develops the scenarios? Politicians, economists, financiers, CEOs, professors, modelers, journalists, heads of NGOs, billionaires, celebrities, they're the ones that frame the climate debate. And they're all in the top 1%. And if they're not there, they're desperately trying to clamour to get there, which is what we come to university for. And so surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, we have this sort of rubbish that we have now. They're very eloquent, beautifully written, nice plots, but just nonsense. And that's what we've been doing for 30 years. So, look at what we have produced. Our scenarios are awash with perfect green technology that's suddenly installed at the press of a button in the model. Carbon taxes that drive these things. Carbon taxes, they're all done on elasticity of demand, but there are no elasticity of demand if you're looking at large changes. We don't know what they are. The elasticity of demand are all marginal changes that we use in the economic models, so completely inappropriate models. It's all about reinforcing the status quo, because we have done very well at the status quo. So this lot here, which I'm in, we've done very well, and we know that. And the last thing we want to do is bring equity in, because as soon as you bring equity in, that you have a whole load of really deeply uncomfortable questions about distribution, fairness, power, and all those other things that we do not want to have questioned. And we may be good people, but we're still locked into this. And our job as academics is to sometimes step outside that and reflect on our own position, our own role in this, and why is it we think the things that we do think, because they're often not neutral. So I come back to this part here. Does anyone know where this is? Does anyone here live in Cambridge? Does no one live here? In King's Hedges? Yeah, King's Hedges, yeah. Avebury? Anyone live in Avebury? North Abbey? Surprisingly. Just because perhaps they're in the 9 most deprived locations in the UK or something. So, these are where people who are on £23,000 to £31,000 a year live. But there's no climate people working out of these places. They're not developing the scenarios. So is it surprising we don't know anything about these people? We don't even want to think about them. They're just the little people out there, little pawns in our models. So how many of these, £31,000 a year, how many academics and professors get anything like that? The average income for a professor in the UK is £85,000. Remember, the median for a household is 31. You cannot understand that world. You may have been through it, we all make a claim. I claim I came from a council house, so I've completely forgotten that now. It was a long time ago. I've turned it into some sort of glossy memory in my head. And so we have to start to think about getting other people involved to say, well, what is feasible? Their view of what is feasible is completely different to a professor who flies around the world to attend worthless climate change conferences. But also I'd argue, and I'll give you the names of them actually, of a paper that relates to this. The scenarios, I would argue, and I was quite careful of trying to think about the word to use here, because contempt is a strong word. So I'm not saying that the individuals doing this are demonstrating contempt, but they're certainly not questioning the contempt that's coming out of their analysis, or is embedded in their analysis. Look at the scenarios out there, all the major mitigation models. Remember, these are scenarios, not predictions. So they're saying about what the future could look like or should look like if you want to respond to climate change. All the modelling groups are based in wealthy countries, and most of them in European and Anglo-Saxon. I think Japan's got one as well. I think all, and if you have any exceptions to this, I'll be pleased to know, all the scenarios submitted to the IPCC maintain huge inequality between developed and developing countries, which is completely counter to what we've signed up to every single year going back to 1992. And actually, many of the scenarios see the difference between the poor and the wealthy countries actually increase. So the scenarios embed ongoing, very high levels of consumption in the wealthy parts of the world. And there's a paper by, I would certainly recommend following these people here. They're just, and they've both got, well, the first one and the last one, they've got really active Twitter accounts. There's some really good presentations that were given in Glasgow and other places as well related to their papers. Very disturbing. I mean, they're really disturbing papers. But that one there captures quite a lot of this. This is a quote from the conclusion and the abstract, actually. Our results show the IPCC AR6 scenarios disregard both the historical responsibility of the global north for carbon emissions as well as the future energy needs of the global south required to meet development goals. The burden of climate change mitigation is placed squarely on less developed countries, whilst developed countries continue to increase their energy consumption. Yeah. Not only do we not care about equity in our own countries, we don't give a damn about it in our own countries, we just say, no, poor people will have to remain poor. And we've completely normalised that. And then we embed net zero to make it all sound cheery. It's just, we're party to something that is really very disturbing. And we are party to it through our silence as well. So where does all this leave us? Well, first, second and third glance, and probably 50th glance, things aren't looking too good. So we've got the impacts of 1.5 look set to be worse than we previously imagined. We're squandering the budget at 1% every month, and roughly 0.5% heading that way for 2 degrees centigrade. We're locked into, or we've committed to balance deep emission cuts with improved well-being for poorer parts of the world, which we're actually obviously ignoring. So that means fossil fuels for wealthy parts of the world have to be zero fossil fuel use by about 2030 to 2035, and the others, but somewhere, depending on which country they are, behind that. Some out to 2050 for some of the poorest countries, and probably other ones nearer 2040. In fact, we've got a detailed report out on phase out of fossil fuel production, looking at all 97 producers of fossil fuels that came out a couple of years ago. I can give a reference to that if someone wants. It goes to every country and roughly what they, using an equity framing, what their time frame for the phase out would be. There's a huge difference of responsibility for emissions within nations. If you look at somewhere like the UK, there's a massive difference, and the same for all countries. But the expert group, well, maybe there's a few exceptions, but the expert group is deeply locked into a highly inequitable status quo. We have been co-opted. But I think there's some sort of, I always wonder, am I just grasping at straws here? I think there's some sort of hope out there. And I think actually some of that's emerged from the civil society movement, sort of messy gaggle of civil society movements in recent years, much more so than from the academic community. And that's given some voice to early career researchers as well. I mean, by and large, if you get to my age, you're locked into the status quo. You're wandering around with your big baggage of yesteryear nonsense. But so some early career researchers now are starting to speak out. And I think I do know from some of the ones that are speaking out, and in fact, sometimes they're getting sort of locked up as well. They're speaking out because civil society has given them that sense, that opportunity to go out and do that. So I think there are some benefits. There are some positive things out there. And this one I think is really important, that for the majority, even in wealthy countries, responding to climate change, forget climate change, just park it as an issue. Responding to climate change is really positive. And I'm not a great fan of win-win things, but I think here it's win-win-win. So if you respond to climate change in the 1.5 to 2 degree C framing, you have to have comfortable, affordable homes. You can't carry on having what the UK calls houses when what we really mean is tents. They're incredibly inefficient. So a Swedish tent is about as efficient as a UK house. So they're just terrible. But we have to, and we know whose houses they are, of course, they're the poor people's houses. So we have to do something about those. But to do something about that and transport means you've got to have lots of high quality, secure employment. Not call centres, not zero-hours contracts. People have to be properly trained to retrofit the houses, to build the public transport systems, to put in the cables for other renewables or whatever it might be. All of that stuff needs doing. And you can't just buy it in. It's labour at home. It's domestic. So high quality public transport. This is if we want to respond to climate change. Much better air quality, good for health. That means you're good for education as well, because those things all play out evenly. Remember one of the richest countries in the world, we had someone die of mold in a council, in a housing association place. Recently came out in the coroner's inquest. You know, a child dies of mold spores in a housing association house in the 6th richest country in the world. We'd have to have a functioning infrastructure, improved civic well-being. I mean, these things are sort of generally quite attractive to most people. But this requires a massive mobilization of resources and labor from the private luxury of people like me, from the few, to working for everyone else. And this doesn't mean just giving it to them, it actually means for the infrastructure. You're not just handing the money from rich people to poor people or rich people to average people. You've taken it and building an infrastructure. So it is like the Marshall-style reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War. It's that sort of thing. It's private sufficiency and public luxury. But we've got exactly the opposite of this. There was a good Financial Times article out a little while ago, which was quite surprising. The Financial Times, that well-known left-leaning magazine or newspaper, and it looked at all the OECD countries and it looked at their sort of distribution and so forth. And it referred to the US and the UK as poor countries with some very rich people, and that captures the UK so well today. But although I'm saying that there are plenty of people that you can describe a really progressive vision for them. People who the Labour Party and the Conservative Party would pejoratively call red wall voters. You know, those people, these are much more attractive futures for them. But don't underestimate the people opposing them. There are huge forces rallied up against any sort of progressive agenda on climate change. And that includes the great and good, the expert community, and that, I mean, very much a lot of academics as well as CEOs and all the rest of it. We have a lot to lose, because that shift of material resources and labour are the labour and resources that are looking after our well-being today, our excessive well-being. And so we would have to forgo that, because they're going to be doing things like putting in trams rather than building us a new snooker room in Wilmslow or something. So there's a big shift here. And of course, we are the ones that are very influential, the way the system is today. But I would argue in democracies, and I'm sort of stretching outside my realm. I'm interested in all this stuff now. I've been reading about it for a long time, but it's not, I'm an engineer. So this is not my realm, really. But to me, it seems that power is as much accepted, and certainly very much in universities, we can stand up against our illustrious leaders if we want to. We very, very seldom do, but we could do. It's as much accepted as it is imposed. And particularly in democracies. I mean, it's not true of other parts of the world. I mean, you can lose your life if you stand up against the establishment, but and we know that occurs. But it doesn't happen very often in these parts of the world. And the numbers favour this group. They don't say favour the Davos group. Yeah, the majority could actually say, we're not going to put up with the crap that the minority keep imposing on us. They could do that. We could do that if we wanted to. And the more people that join and contribute to that debate, I think the more you open up a different way of thinking. And we actually had that in a paper we published last year, where power turned out from looking at 9 different lenses, some technical, some social science lenses, looking at the issue of why haven't we bent the emissions curve, and power came out as a key issue there. But power is something that is not just that top down. We allow it to some degree. So I think you're coming towards the end here. I think you've got a choice here. I don't think there's a neat way out of this. Maybe there is. If someone else can think of a way out of it, then let me know. There's a velvet or a violent revolution. The velvet revolution was someone might know about in the Czech Republic and so forth. So some people may. And I'm not saying that was all wonderful, but I'm just using it as a sort of catch-all term here. I see no way out of revolutionary change in how we, and it's the we, who is the we in this, how we live today. It's too late for non-radical futures. There isn't a non-radical future. I know the IMs are washed with non-radical futures, but they're just mythical nonsense. So the choice is between deep, rapid, and organised decarbonisation of modern society. Now, I'm not saying what the policies would look like. They would vary from country to country, depending on the culture of your country. So the culture very much colours the types of policies you would use, but they'd have to deliver something within the sort of carbon budget framing. If you can argue that's a velvet revolution, to actually recognise that and do something about it. Or we just carry on with lies, rhetoric, and delay. The temperatures go up, and then it'll be dangerous for everyone, and then you've got a violent revolution. So take your pick. Now, I know what most of us do, who are at my age, will say, we'll go with the violent one, because I probably won't be around. I reckon I can survive long enough, and I don't really love my kids that much. They're a bit of a fashion accessory. So I think most of us lean towards the violent revolution, unfortunately. And we don't really want to scratch our skin to look a bit deeper, because we find something very uncomfortable beneath that scratch. This is it's a long quote, this, but I really like this, because all this sounds like pie-in-the-sky nonsense, and perhaps it is. Perhaps it is. But we don't know. This is Herman. Who knows about Herman Daly? A few hands go up. I have a huge amount of time for Herman Daly. I don't think I've ever warmed to him particularly, but I really like his way of looking at the world. Probably would have been nice over a beer or a glass of wine or something. He recently died, very, very sadly. But this is something I just read one of the obituaries, and this was from something he'd written. My duty is to do the best I can and put out some ideas. Whether the seed that I plant is going to grow up is not up to me. It's just up to me to plant it and water it. I get lots of criticism in the sense of, I don't like that. That's unrealistic. I mean, climate change, I hear that all the time about these sorts of things. I don't get criticism in the more rational sense of your prepositions are wrong, or the logic which you reason from is wrong. Josesko Rogan, who some people might also know, does some fantastic, he's a thermodynamicist, but did a lot of wonderful stuff around steady-state economics, made many of the same arguments, and he was also completely ignored. In his case, he also made other contributions to mathematical economics. He was a really good mathematical economist, which should have given him credibility lent him credibility to his more radical ideas, but they didn't. I lack the independent thing, so it's even more unlikely I will be taken seriously. But unlikely things do happen. And I think that's, when we so often hear that's not realistic, you couldn't deliver that. I think that is really worth bearing in mind. Lots and lots of unlikely things. History is littered with unlikely things happening. And even in the climate realm, if you went back 5 years, 6 years, you thought, who might change the debate a little bit on this? I think how would you say, I think it might be a 15-year-old Swedish schoolgirl. Do you think anyone would have said that? I don't think so. Now, she isn't going to change all the climate change agenda. She's just a catalyst for change amongst others. But you wouldn't have thought to look for a Swedish schoolgirl as someone that would catalyse a sort of wider mobilisation of concern, which he certainly has done. So I think unlikely things happen. And our job as academics is to stick to our integrity. And this gives us some hope, I think, that, I think some hope that what we do is worthwhile. So to conclude, the headline choice for the UK, and in fact I would argue for all developed countries, is either we can ignore international equity, we can pass a huge burden of climate change onto our children, part of a 3 to 4 degrees centigrade, 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade, or 4 degrees, or whatever it might be, future. We can renege on our commitments, but that beautifully fits with the ephemeral politics of today. It maintains the market economic model, all those other wonderful things that are immutable, it would appear, in our modern society. We can't possibly question these things. That gives us sort of 5% per annum mitigation, which some modelers say we can just about deliver with maintain the status quo, net zero by 2050, and just hope our children will forgive us. Or we take international equity seriously, which means a huge mitigation effort by this generation. I mean, something akin to the sort of Marshall-style change, along with a major sort of social revolution, if you like. Cut CO2 in line with 1.5 degrees centigrade, or at the very outside 2, abide by our commitments that we sign up to. But that needs a huge ramp up in government leadership, a reshaping of mainstream economics. You could argue that's been ongoing anyway since 2007 banking crisis and then COVID. So we don't really have mainstream economics at the moment. We pretend we have, but it's all over the place. And equity has to be at its core, whether you agree with the morals or not. Just from the maths point of view, you can't squeeze emissions out of people that hardly emit. So we're stuck with the simple numbers. That's 15 to 25% per annum mitigation and real zero by 2035, for fossil fuels at least, I mean for wealthy parts of the world. To live on Paris needs new narratives. We need to think about what constitutes growth, progress and development. So I think sort of open these debates up, reframe values and success, and we reward those things by paying people more so they can consume more and have a higher carbon footprint. Are there different ways that we can think about rewarding people in society? And should we actually be rewarding individuals rather than the system that we're all part of? Have a better relationship with time. We're terrible in our attitude towards time, I think. Embed intra- and intergenerational equity. Have a much deeper appreciation for the modern human world. All of this revolutionary stuff, I think, is captured by the IPCC. I mean, normally this is just all some sort of left-wing nonsense. Well, the IPCC are barely renowned for being particularly left-wing. This is from the IPCC. Targeting a climate-resilient, sustainable world involves fundamental changes to how society functions, including changes to underlying values, worldviews, ideologies, social structures, political economic systems, and power relationships. I mean, I could just put that up at the beginning and say, well, that's it, the IPCC have told us. I mean, what I'm saying here is sort of conventional, and what most of us probably know, but don't really want to accept. So we're in a position where I think we're looking for some sort of Rooseveltian type leadership. If they haven't ever read them, it's Fireside Speeches. They're really worth looking at. So Roosevelt's Fireside Speeches, it was all about vision and courage. Roosevelt never bothered with some bloody focus group or other crap, and fear and things like that. I mean, they weren't part of his dialogue. And he got 4 terms in office. Now, I'm not saying everything about him was fine, but he suggested some really radical changes to society at the time. He wasn't just tweaking the status quo. But let's also be clear that that sort of leadership isn't just top down. We need bottom up leadership. It's not just waiting for a great leader from above. We all, in a sense, have that opportunity. Top down leadership is not independent from bottom up. They're inexorably linked in a really messy sort of way, an emergent way. And in that sense, we all have an opportunity to catalyse change. It's probably quite hard to see how it works out because it is emergent, but we all have that opportunity, and certainly in democracies, to catalyse change. So on that note, thank you for listening.
Well, Kevin, as expected, that was food for thought. We have, in 2 weeks' time, we have Labour MP for Cambridge, Daniel Zeichner, coming to talk to us. And I think the title of his talk is Climate Change in the Context of UK Politics. Maybe you can tune into it. But now, look, let's suppose...
Shouldn't it be the other way around?
I asked him. I gave him 2 titles. I said, UK politics in the context of climate change.
Yeah.
Anyway, but there you go. So what, in advance of his talk, what question do you want to ask Daniel Zeichner?
Well, I don't know his particular view within the Labour Party, but if it's a sort of Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves supporter, then it'll be growth, growth, growth. And I was asking him how he can reconcile that with staying within the carbon budgets that we've signed up to, or certainly the temperature commitments we've signed up to. I just don't think you can reconcile them. He'll spout some sort of chip, well, maybe he's really eloquent and so forth, but he'll likely just chip off some stuff about decoupling and other nonsense like that. I mean, that virtually doesn't occur, and the rates of decoupling are incredibly slow. He'll probably talk about the UK having a big reduction in emissions since 1990. Well, it's about 0.5% a year, so you can say it's 0.5%, not, it's a fraction of what we need. And even if you took the last 10 years, some people say we've done much more in the last 10 years, it's 2.5%. So it's about 1/10 of what we need for 1.5 degrees centigrade and about 1/5 of what we need for 2 degrees centigrade. So how does he reconcile growth, growth, growth with 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade? That would be my question to him.
There we go. We've got that question then for a couple of weeks' time. So look, Kevin, why don't you come and have a seat here? We've got various questions that are going to come in from the audience. Would you like a bit of...
Oh, so I've got a little bit in here, thanks. Cheers.
We've got various questions that are going to come in from Twitter. Please put questions in, hashtag CCLS2013 on YouTube as well. I think we're monitoring the feed on YouTube. But let's start with questions from the audience. Talio's got a microphone over there, and Sean has got a microphone over there. Hands up, and we do want to have questions from students if we can, as well as from the usual suspects. Why don't we start with a younger person here, and then we'll move through. There we go. Yeah.
Hi. It's a big pressure to start off. Thank you so much for the talk. I was quite surprised because at the beginning you did mention that it was a good thing for a scientist to be naive when it came to policy, and then when we came, or political views. And then after your talk, for a long time, I could sense a bit what in Marxist terms would be considered that as climate change as a class war a bit. So I sense that you're not as political naive as you suggested at the beginning. So my question was, how is your view, and if you could elaborate on that, on the position of the scientist as a political subject? Thank you.
It's quite challenging, that. I would argue, what I tried to say a little bit at the end, to touch on it, that I'm not saying what the policy framework would look like. So I'm talking more about the strategic framework. And I think the policy framework is more about what sort of policies you use. Do you use regulations? Do you use carbon taxes? You know, what do you use in that? You just sort of say, well, you know, the wealthy can have everything, the poor can just starve. I mean, you could do it different ways. That's what the politics with a small p, if you like, or large p, rather, chooses. But I would argue that what I was trying to show, and clearly failed, was that if you just follow the numbers through, it takes you to quite a political position. I mean, that's just what the numbers take you to. Well, no, that's not true. It's what our commitments, then interpreted through the numbers, take us to. So we've decided what levels of impact we will accept. That comes out, play out with some temperatures, and that takes us to some numbers, which tells us something about the sort of the constraint on the politics that we have. So I think that obviously I failed, but what I was trying to say was that the politics actually, there's not a lot of choice in that, but there is a choice about the policy suites you opt for. So if you're in Scandinavia, they probably use far more regulations. Over here, we seem to love taxes of one sort or another, and the Chinese might just ban a lot of things. So you know, countries would use different policy suites depending on their politics with a big P, if you like. I'm not sure I escaped your critique there, but
So just let's move on, because we'll have opportunity for discussion afterwards.
I missed that.
So just to prove that we're getting questions from from YouTube, I've got one here from YouTube, which is given everything Kevin has said about the COP process, what does he think about COP28 being held in the UAE? Is it a mask slipping moment or a genuine opportunity to change course?
Well, I think it's a mask slipping, exercise a bit more, or that's what's happening. But that mask, I mean, that it slipped in some ways is a good thing. That mask was there all before. I mean, the COP in Glasgow was a mask. It had a mask. It didn't slip, so we didn't see behind it so easily. Well, some people did, but not a lot of people didn't. Thought it was a sort of genuine sort of process. The COP process, I'm not completely opposed to the COP process, but they are unhealthily political. They don't. They allow things to happen that simply are just, I think anyone would describe them simply as wrong. You know, when most of the stakeholders there emerge from the sort of, particularly in the main meetings, come from things like the fossil fuel industry. I think that is really disturbing. That you can't mention fossil fuels in the final reports. That the fossil fuel companies, who are effectively often the governments as well in some parts of the world, sort of say, you know, we won't have that mentioned at all. So I think there's a lot of really deep problematic things in the COP process. I think the one that we've got next year is just, to me, it seems like a complete and utter scam, and that they are so blatant about it now that we don't care the fact that it's in a major oil-producing country that, you know, but the UK was, of course, a big oil-producing country as well. But they also that they've got the head of their oil and gas company as the chair for it. I mean, it's just sticking two fingers up to the rest of us, and we'll stay quiet about it. And no doubt, lots and lots of academics have already booked their flights to go over there to have a jolly with other friends from elsewhere in the world at it. I think it's a disgrace. We should probably, at an academic level, be boycotting the next COP, I think, and probably a lot of the NGOs as well, and maybe looking for a replacement. What else would we do instead?
So you don't see it as an opportunity to change course?
The people going to those things, the top end one will not be changing course. They will have to be dragged kicking and screaming. So do not expect, you know, a top-down change. They will only change if and there are some good people there, and they're looking for catalysts from the rest of society, but you know, don't look for top-down change to drive us on climate change. It's going to have to be driven. They're going to have to be dragged kicking and screaming. Yeah. And some of them will have to pack up what they do in the process.
So we've got a question here.
Hi, Andrew Lockley from UCL. You seem to be framing the problem in very much sort of social transformation terms, but Britain's had a highly unequal society since at least William the Conqueror, but we've only been using fossil fuels for a couple of 100 years and gas for maybe 50 at any scale. So isn't it probably quite a lot easier to effect change to the energy mix rather than persuading the rich people to give all their money to the poor people? I mean, it seems a lot stickier socially that we have inequity in society. It just seems a bit utopian to try and change society when all we need to do is change the energy mix, right?
Well, I love that last bit there. All you need to do is change the energy mix. I just think the reason I come to this conclusion, I think this is our job as academics to reflect regularly. I have a particular view on politics, where my politics comes from, and I probably reflect on it 2 or 3 times a week to say, is it affecting my judgment? And undoubtedly it will be to some degree, but at least I'm trying to stop that. The reason I can't come to your conclusion is because of what I mentioned before, because of time. You cannot deliver in any way that I could understand, and I've looked at this in some detail, the changes that are necessarily technically to stay within those carbon budgets. You simply cannot deliver it. So why I say that technology, and I think I've made that point, technology is a prerequisite of responding to climate change. It is deeply insufficient. So because we've left it so late, because we've got those carbon budgets, if we're going to abide by those, that forces us down the issues of the social change. There is no way out of that other than to fail on delivering on them. So you cannot make those changes. And just to give some sort of scale of that, the UK consumes, so just for the UK bit, one I know best, 1,600 terawatt hours a year is our final energy consumption in the UK. 300 terawatt hours is electricity, of which roughly half is low carbon. So around about 150 terawatt hours of low carbon energy in the UK, but we consume 1,600 terawatt hours in the UK. So you have to go from 1,500, so 150 to 1,600 terawatt hours almost overnight. Not a cat and hell's chance of doing that technically. Now you can do it in the model, but when you build these things, as I say, I have been involved in some big gas terminals and some offshore platforms and gas terminals in the UK. It's really hard to build big infrastructure because things get in the way. You know, like towns, cities, roads, railways. Those things, you can't just shut them down overnight. You've got to dismantle them, put bypasses in whilst you put a pipeline. So it takes you 6 months to put a pipeline that's a mile long. And so all of that technical stuff slows us down. But we should be doing much more. That's why I say it's like a Marshall-style reconstruction with a sort of a Rooseveltian view of society. You start to bring those together, and you look at something that might align with the carbon budgets that we've got.
We've got a question over here.
Thank you. Well, that is on. You talked a lot about like the changes that are required in the kind of coming years and kind of the system changes and the ideological changes and changes to the economic models and that sort of stuff. But the word I didn't hear you mention once, and maybe this is kind of trying to maintain your academic kind of element, is capitalism and capital. And I guess it's probably quite a familiar question, but I've not heard you answer it, so I'm going to ask you anyway. And I'm guessing you're kind of familiar with the debate of kind of, do we have time to dismantle capitalism and then respond to climate change in the sense you're suggesting of kind of having new economic models, new political systems? And there are very kind of arch anti-capitalists, Noam Chomsky, for example, that say we actually don't have time to do this sort of dismantling system change and then go on and do kind of the climate action that we need, climate mitigation that we need, given that it's going to take, I don't know, maybe 10 years of radical action to actually dismantle the global system. I wonder if you had kind of thoughts on that and reflections, given that we don't have time to kind of do that and then meet our 1.5 or 2 degree budgets.
It isn't something I get asked a lot. I sort of continue to reflect on it. Firstly, I think capitalism is a bit too much of a catch-all term. So, you know, Sweden and the US, both capitalist, but significant differences between them. Well, there was until the recent government in Sweden. They're much more closely aligned now. Anyway, so there are big differences in sort of what those capitalist models might look like. And I would also argue that since 2007, the capitalist model has sort of, in some elements of it, has sort of been, it's been thrown in the air from the banking crisis, and then, I mean, the recent sort of with the furlough and COVID, all of that, what that's thrown in the air as well. I mean, I think it's asked some fundamental questions of the capitalist model. And if the capitalist model is supposed to give, bread and beer to all the classes and probably wine and caviar to some, then it's failed, isn't it? Because we've seen that for large parts of the UK, for instance, and probably true for a lot of continental Europe, people have not seen any improvement. In fact, some of them have seen a reduction in their quality of life, material quality of life, over the last 10 years. So perhaps this is exactly the time to be asking those questions. But I'd also come back at the end of the day, if we're serious about the climate change commitments we've made, you haven't got any choice but to make those system level changes. There simply isn't a way out of it. So all you have to say is, well, we'll fail on those and we'll have higher temperatures. Well, fine, but that's going to dismantle your model anyway. That's why I'm saying the future is radically different from the present, regardless of which way you go. And so I think, so we haven't got time to dismantle it. Well, we haven't got time to not dismantle it. So we have to, in some way, start to unpick this thing. Sometimes I think the language itself, this language of capitalism, like you evoke the sort of language of Marx, I think for some people that just puts people off. So I think we have to find forms of words that try to bring more people on board, and ways of describing things that perhaps can avoid that sort of language. That's what I tried to do a little bit by saying we look at the good things for the majority in our society that we would gain out of those things. There are lots of positives about responding to climate change, but unfortunately not for professors.
So
I have
there's
many thoughts, but
a message. There's a message from Extinction Rebellion here.
A single voice from Extinction Rebellion.
What would be a proportional response from audience members to this presentation? What actions should people take? What actions should we be taking?
Well, my number one is always, you don't have to agree with me, but just integrity, and have the courage to stand by what you not believe, I think, because I'm worried about beliefs, what you conclude. So do your thinking, do the graft, and then have the courage to stand by your conclusions and speak about them vociferously, with some humility, because we all make mistakes. So people might point things out you haven't thought about. But that integrity and doing the graft is really what I think is our job as academics, and then to communicate clearly and bluntly and politely. Normally, I normally fail. I do fail on the last one.
So yes, here we've got one now.
Well, I hope you won't mind my being rather aggressive.
No.
But the point is that I bet almost everybody in this audience agrees with the points that you're making, but a majority of the world does not. And a few things. First of all, David Mackay, who you so admired, and I do too, he was a wonderful guy, he always said, and that was one of the main points in his book, you want to choose a parameter that's appropriate. You want to choose an argument that's appropriate. 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, you know, it's going to be 2 degrees colder by the time I get home. So what are you making such a to-do about 1.5, 2 degrees? That seems ridiculous. The other thing, because the chairman is Australian, I'll give you some Australian examples, which I think are important. First...
You're Australian too, okay.
That was between you and I. The chairman of BHP, the third largest company in the world, the largest mining company, Andrew Mackenzie, was thrown out because he kept on saying to the board, we have to consider our climate contribution and our putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And they said, garbage, garbage, garbage. We have to consider the money we're making for our shareholders. And they threw him out, and he's now, well, head of Shell. That's an interesting question. But
okay, we need to get to a question, or otherwise we'll move on.
Okay, and a final point then I'll make. Sorry, no. Oh yeah, Australia makes a huge amount of money out of fossil fuel exports. If we followed what you say, and I do agree with you, Australia, his country, would lose an enormous amount of money. Now, how do you present this argument so that people who are not so convinced are going to change?
Yeah. Well, the first bit, the very first bit you said that we agree, but lots of other people don't. I would disagree on that. And why do you think we agree, or in this room broadly agree, and others don't? What privileges us over and above a lot of other people? I think lots of other people would come to similar conclusions, and probably if we chat in the pub over these sort of things, would come to similar conclusions. The bit about 1 and 1.5 and 2 degrees, but there are significant groups who won't, and most of those are usually wealthy. The 1.5 and 2, I agree with you. I think they're really unhelpful. Unfortunately, I think in 2023 it's too late to be revisiting them. You know, in hindsight, even quite a few years ago, we should have said they're very unhelpful. You know, if you live in Manchester, 2 degrees centigrade warmer sounds quite pleasant. So, you know, they aren't helpful, but we've got them, and we've had to, and I think most people have got some sort of handle on what they might mean now in some sort of vague fashion. So I think they're okay like that. Your point in Australia, well, Australia's going to lose money if it carries on with the fossil fuels. It's going to lose money if it gets rid of the fossil fuels, and it's got a choice. If it gets rid of the fossil fuels, I think Australia is quite a warm place. They could be producing quite a lot of hydrogen if they wanted to. It probably is. You probably, in various ways, you might be able to make some synthetic fuel out of that maybe feed into the aviation market. They could find another way to be more innovative with their resources. They are going to wipe out their own economy, let alone their own population, by carrying on by burning fossil fuels and selling fossil fuels. And anyway, that market I think will likely dry out. So why not be a bit more preemptive and think it through? So as I say, there are no non-radical futures, including for Australia.
So now we'll try and fit in as many questions as we can. We've got one over here, yeah?
Yes, I thought the question short. Great presentation. I think you painted a somewhat unduly rosy. But your entire presentation was focused on the IPCC and decarbonisation.
Yeah.
This is the word geoengineering. I guess.
Now, yeah, geoengineering. The reason I didn't talk about it particularly is I haven't come to a conclusion yet. My initial take, my first sort of take on it, is a bit like with CDR. Let's do the research, and if we can test it out on sustainability criteria, and I mean ecological and social, not the social bit's massively important in that, then perhaps we could try it out in small pilot schemes and see how we get on. But it comes with as does CDR, it undermines the need for mitigation. It will be used straight away to avoid having to do something about cutting our emissions. And so there's that difficult dilemma, which is it worth pursuing it? I almost like to say pursue it quietly. Would be because as soon as it's in the dialogue, like the CDR, the bean counters will be out there and they'll find some way to compensate for definitely doing something today. We'll expand the airports, which is okay because we're going to put some sulfates into the atmosphere.
So that's when I first met you, I think, Kevin, in Paris.
Yeah.
Nick Breeze dragged us into a corner. We did an impromptu discussion about this topic.
It's had lots of viewings, that strange deal.
It's quite, that was, when was that? Sort of 7 years ago.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the things you said then are kind of, because then was then, now things are much more pressing. So there are different nuance to our
there's over 250 billion tonnes of CO2 gone out in the atmosphere since then.
Now let's see if we can get a couple more questions in. We've got one here.
Right. Okay, well, you had Extinction Rebellion remotely. You have somebody from Extinction Rebellion here. So I've been part... You okay?
Yeah, it's fine. Just drop my surgical truss.
I've been part of a group protesting at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership in Cambridge. It's part of the university. Mostly about their greenwashing of business as usual, okay? So they have partners such as Barclays and HSBC, super fossil fuel investors, etc., and Heathrow Airport. I think that's laughable to call those sustainable partners. I wonder what you think about those as sustainability leaders, and who would you suggest that the Institute ought to be partnering with?
Is this the same organisation that Jonathan Porritt was involved with initially?
Not sure. It's CISL, if that's any help.
Okay.
No, I don't know.
Okay.
It was with some of the people he works with. So
it was, okay, yeah. I thought it was. Because I remember, I think I gave some talks in the early days, and I was a bit uncomfortable going along to these fancy venues there was somewhere, some exotic looking, or some stately home somewhere, and the sort of great and good flying from all around the world to chat about climate change. I probably think we've got to such a point now that we have to call I'm about to say, is that right? I'm not allowed to say that politically anymore. Where you have to call something what it is. Can you still use that? Can you call a spade a spade? And so I don't think we should be involving with these organisations. We should be calling them out for what they are. I don't think we should be having them, within our midst and treating them as integral partners with integrity. They have demonstrated repeatedly that they are not. At some point, you have to stand back and say, we will treat you as the charlatans you've demonstrated to be over the last umpteen years. So I think we have to do that. We have to call it out. Maybe try and call it out as politely as possible, but very directly. So no, I don't think we should be hoodwinked by these organisations anymore. Who would I use as alternatives? I mean, there are a few out there. And even those you have some problems with. There are people like Patagonia. So I know from the outdoor world, there are a few generally quite small organisations that are trying to do something significantly different. Interface Flooring was one that used to be regularly trotted out. We seem to be doing some quite good work, I think, a long time ago. So it's quite hard to find really strong business leaders, I think, who are demonstrating anywhere near the sort of level of commitment that we've got today. But certainly the ones we often engage with are the real pariahs. I mean, HSBC, Barclays, they're the Exxon, Shells, BPs, all of that lot are a disgrace in my view.
So there are a few questions, 3 or 4 on the same theme about positive feedbacks and tipping points and how this fits into your picture.
Okay, I did try to sort of just touch on that a little bit, and I know that gone now, but the gentleman raised that earlier, that there's certainly lots of science out there that suggests that the sort of headline carbon budgets in the IPCC don't appropriately factor these things in. I think that's a slightly unfair reading of the IPCC Working Group 1 on this, because I think that they do try to talk about them elsewhere, but only if you bother to read through lots and lots of text. Not in the
executive summary.
Not an executive summary, and it's quite challenging to read that stuff as well. I mean, it's not an easy read, and perhaps it should in some way be summarised, because that's what I say. It's very. I think you have to take it as a conservative. Certainly, the headline stuff is sort of very conservative values. So I think they are really important questions, and from a precautionary point of view, given what you're looking at, from a precautionary point of view, that's why I say I think we really need to think about these things that are out there. But even if you just took the headline values, the sorts of changes I'm talking about are at the absolute extreme end of what we can now deliver. So my guess is we probably, even if we did these things, we would probably fail on these temperatures, because it is likely that the values I'm using are too conservative.
Yeah. So we've got time for one more question here.
Thanks. Philippa from Global Sustainability Institute at Anglia Ruskin. Thanks for a really interesting talk. You mentioned at the start that you did a similar talk for Whitehall.
Yeah,
I just wondered what the response there was from that audience.
And this is what I find, let's come back to your point actually, others don't think this is the case. Almost whenever I give a talk, that either the people are scared stiff of me for some reason, which is certainly not the case, or people will say, whether it's NGOs, business leaders, policymakers, civil society groups, we get it, just the others don't. Well, I haven't met the others yet. I mean, I give talks to sort of CEOs and executive types. I'm doing that in a couple of weeks in Sweden. It's some skiing thing they're all going to. Sort of the head of IKEA and people like that will be there. And they'll all say, oh, yes, we thought this is really important, but it's the customers. And then when I talk to civil society groups, who are the customers, it's why aren't the leaders doing it? And then the politicians are saying, well, the public won't vote for it. And the public saying, why aren't the politicians demonstrating leadership? Everyone's waiting for someone else. So I actually don't think it's, I mean, there are big groups, as I say, railed against this sort of stuff as well, but they are generally the wealthy who have done remarkably well out of this. I mean, I use a Davos set as a collective sort of noun for that group, that sort of mindset. But that's a relatively small part of the world that's locked into that way of thinking. For the others, I think, by and large, this is a sellable sort of package, if you like. But the reason we won't sell it, because who's going to sell it? The journalists, we want to sell it. I mean, we don't want it. We don't want this. And so somehow it's got to come out from somewhere else. That's why I'm saying it's as much bottom up as top down. I'm not expecting top down leadership from senior academics or from policymakers. I think we will all need dragging by wider civil society. But wherever I go, I generally get, people have some disagreements like we've got here, but broadly a sympathetic hearing, and people say, I don't disagree with it significantly. Is that a hope? Is that hope in that in some way?
There we go. So we're just about to wind up. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sean Fitzgerald, who's the director of the Centre for Climate Repair, to give the closing remarks, and perhaps you might have a question to ask as well. But I do want to say that the great advantage of attending these events in person is that we've got a selection of vegan wraps to be consumed in the room next door, so do stay. Kevin will be sticking around for an hour or more to engage in further questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, it's fine by me. Yeah.
And there's some wine as well, so do stick around. Those online will just have to open a bottle of wine on their own. In 2 weeks' time, that's on the 2nd of March, we'll be here again, 7 o'clock in the evening, to hear Daniel Zeichner, Labour MP, talking about his perspectives on climate change in the context of UK politics, and again vegan wraps afterwards, and so do come along. Sean, would you like to pose a question and give closing remarks?
No, I got the hint, Hugh. I'm going to actually just end with some closing remarks.
You could ask them.
No. We can do that. We can do that afterwards. So, Kevin, what I would like to say on behalf of everybody is that we're so very, very grateful to you for coming to actually be with us and share some of your insights. One of the big takeaways for me tonight was how you started and how you finished. You started with, I thought, a very appropriate health warning on how we should interpret the IPCC reports. In other words, because of the way that they're compiled, is that they are inevitably, therefore, extremely conservative. However, you finished with that beautiful set of words from the IPCC, which I actually don't think is very conservative at all. About if when you read that, although the numbers appear rather conservative, the text of what is required in order to deliver our sort of the commitments of Paris and actually what the sort of changes that society needs to make are absolutely amazing. And we should take that at heart, because these are things that we need to embrace as wider society. And the last bit of encouragement is that it ain't going to come down from the top. It's going to come from the bottom, which is every one of us. And things like what we do at the ballot box, and actually what should we do more than that about allowing ourselves to have appropriate options at the ballot box and doing more, because that is a fundamental problem that we've got. But Kevin, thank you so much indeed, and we look forward to a glass of wine with you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody who attended on the live stream, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks' time.